Are you set, Chief?
Set.
Well, good morning, everyone. I think most of the media, I've given you the documents that we're releasing today. If you don't have those, please let me know. Just as a housekeeping measure, all of the documents that have been presented to you today will also be posted on our website so that all of the public will have the opportunity to read these documents. In addition, once again, we're going to videotape this news conference ourselves and post it on our YouTube page so people can see this news conference in its entirety if they wish. There's also a reenactment video that's going to be played at the news conference. That too will be up on our YouTube page. I've given everyone here, I think, the list of speakers, and we are going to start this morning with Police Chief Noble Wray. Chief?
Okay, thanks, Joel. I'm going to get right to it because I think we've got a lot that we're going to try and cover today. But before I get into the details, I think it's important that I talk about the human aspect of this incident because we've talked a lot about process and procedure, but I think it's really important to talk about the human aspect on behalf of the Madison Police Department. So on behalf of the Madison Police Department, I deeply regret the set of tragic circumstances that led to the death of Paul Heenan, and I think it's important to bring that up. I also know that the incident on November 9th has created a tremendous amount of grief for the Heenan family, for the O'Malley family, and for those that live in the neighborhood where this incident occurred. At the Madison Police Department, we understand that community trust, from a policing standpoint, is a very fragile, but can be compromised with one high-profile incident. We'll do everything we can to build community trust. We know that those have some challenges with our community trust. We will continue to be transparent. We will listen. We will be professional and caring. I expect and welcome that this incident, that we will have a great deal of community scrutiny, and we do welcome that because an incident of this nature deserves community scrutiny, and under the light of day, we want to provide as much information as possible. With that said, we are releasing as much information as possible. Up to date, we've released 2 press releases. We've had a press conference. I will be releasing today a summary of the findings of the internal affairs. That summary will also provide why we're releasing the summary. I will also be releasing the internal affairs summary, which is approximately 40 pages. We have not done that in the past. Again, wanting to ensure total transparency. Included in that summary, we will be releasing the reenactment of the neighbor, Kevin O'Malley. We will be releasing as well the Department of Justice Training and Standards review of this incident. We will also be processing the records requests that have come in, and we will try and process those in the coming weeks. Since the beginning, we have had a number of people review this, monitor this, and be involved in this investigation. Just so everyone is aware, with these types of incidents, and with this one, I arrived at the scene 3 o'clock that morning. Also who arrived at the scene and later did a walkthrough was the district attorney. The medical examiner was also arrived at the scene. We requested Dane County sheriffs to monitor our investigation. The DA has done his own investigation regarding criminal liability. We have done our own internal investigation to determine if policies and procedures were followed. We have requested Department of Justice Training and Standards to review the use of force from a state's training standards. And all along, I have kept the mayor abreast of what's going on, as well as meeting with the mayor and council leadership to brief them on the status of this investigation. Now I will transition to discuss the findings of the internal investigation. I will provide a brief summary beforehand and discuss the findings. Summary finding of policy number 1. Policy number 1 is 4-500, which refers to police weaponry and how it's used. The internal investigation regarding the officer-involved shooting that occurred on November 9th, 2012 is now complete. As found in the investigation during the early morning hours that date, Officer Heimses responded to a report of a burglary in progress. As he approached the scene, he observed the person he believed to be the homeowner in a physical struggle with another subject. Officer Heimses drew his sidearm, gave loud verbal commands while covering the subject with his firearms. Policy implications and findings. Confronting a potential burglary suspect is a high-risk and dangerous activity for police officers. Officers are trained to address such suspects at gunpoint. This initial action has been determined to be in compliance with Madison Police Department Policy 4-500 Police Weaponry, and is consistent with Madison Police Department policy. The second summary, as it relates to policy number 2, is policy 6-100, deadly force authorized. It is undisputed that the subject, later identified as Paul Heenan, did not comply with Officer Heimses' demands. Unfortunately, and ultimately tragically, and for unknown reasons, Mr. Heenan turned on Officer Heimses, moved to him quickly, and continued not to follow any verbal commands by the officer. Mr. Heenan engaged Officer Heimses physically and grappled with him. It was Officer Heimses' perception that Mr. Heenan also attempted to grab his handgun. Citizen witness, Mr. O'Malley, physically demonstrated, and this is part of a reenactment that you will see later on, physically demonstrated that Mr. Heenan was swinging his hand in the general direction of Officer Heimses' gun. Policy implications and findings on this policy. Officer Heimses believed he was in imminent danger of being disarmed and that his life was in imminent danger. Officer Heimses determined that his only option to protect his life at the time was to use deadly force. Officer Heimses indicated that he was able to push Mr. Heenan and create distance to bring his firearm to bear. He then fired 3 shots in rapid succession, all of which struck Mr. Heenan. Mr. Heenan expired as a result of these 3 gunshots. Officer Heimses' use of deadly force has been determined to be objectively reasonable and in compliance with Madison Police Department Policy 6-100, deadly force authorized, as well as the state of Wisconsin use of force standards. It is important to note that from an officer's perspective, this was a very tense, uncertain, and rapidly evolving situation. It has been determined that from the time Officer Heimses first observed the physical altercation occurring between the homeowner and the subject to the time that the 3 shots were fired was only 15 seconds. Now I would like to turn to Lieutenant Dan Olivas to provide more perspective and details on the internal affairs investigation.
Thank you, Chief. Good morning. My name is Dan Olivas, and I'm the lieutenant in the Professional Standards and Internal Affairs section at the Madison Police Department. You will see that I'm the author of the administrative review of this officer-involved shooting. I was asked to explain what an administrative review is and what it entailed in this case. Anytime an officer deploys deadly force, the department is required by Policy 6-100, deadly force authorized, to conduct an administrative or internal review of the officer's actions. This review is in addition to the criminal investigation which is presented to the district attorney. The administrative review looks at whether the officer's actions were in compliance with police department policy and also looks at whether the actions were in accordance with departmental training. As the chief mentioned, the specific policies that were examined in this particular internal investigation were Policy 4-500, police weaponry, which in part addresses when an officer may draw their weapon and address suspects. The second policy addressed was policy 6-100, deadly force authorized, which specifies when an officer may respond with deadly force. Both of these policies and their relation to this investigation are detailed in the internal investigative document that we're releasing. This particular internal review involved reviewing the entire criminal investigation case file. I also responded and directly monitored the criminal investigation over the first several days it was ongoing. I conducted additional interviews of the officers directly involved in this case, and I consulted with Madison Police Department training staff, who are the defensive and arrest tactics instructors for the department. I also consulted with the city attorney's office. Additionally, I provided the State of Wisconsin Department of Justice Training and Standards Bureau staff with the Madison Police Department use of deadly force policy, the criminal investigation, and all of the materials related to the internal investigation so that they could review Officer Heimsness' actions in relation to the training curriculum approved by the State of Wisconsin Law Enforcement Standards Board. Included in the materials released today is a copy of the report authorized by the Training and Standards Bureau, which indicates their finding that Officer Heimsness' use of force falls within the training curriculum approved by the Law Enforcement Standards Board of the State of Wisconsin. My investigation has revealed the following facts which are undisputed, and some of these are going to be identical to what the chief just relayed. It's not disputed that the incident occurred very early in the morning, starting around 2:44 a.m. A mother called 911 to report that someone had come into her home and that her husband had gone down to investigate, and that she was upstairs with her 4 children. Officers were dispatched to a burglary in progress call where the husband had gone down to investigate. Officers were given a description of the homeowner's clothing. Officer Heimsness was the first officer on scene and observed a physical struggle occurring between the person he believed to be the homeowner and another subject who he considered a possible suspect in the burglary. This possible suspect was later identified as Paul Heenan. The officer covered Mr. Heenan at gunpoint and gave repeated loud verbal commands, which Mr. Heenan did not follow. Mr. Heenan attacked the officer and a physical struggle ensued between the officer and Mr. Heenan. Officer Heimsness continued to shout verbal commands at Mr. Heenan. The officer believed Mr. Heenan was trying to grab his firearm, and the officer believed his life was in imminent danger. The officer fired 3 shots. State Crime Lab investigators have determined the distance between the muzzle of Officer Heimsness' weapon and the subject's clothing was between 24 and 42 inches. We also know that from the time Officer Heimsness observed the physical altercation occurring between Mr. O'Malley and Mr. Heenan to when the shots were fired, only 15 seconds elapsed. It was discovered after the fact that Mr. Heenan's blood alcohol level was at least 0.20. Now, this situation has been broken down and analyzed a great deal. One of the things that was found to be useful in the investigation was to really drill down into what happens in this 15 seconds. We know that when Officer Heimsness observed the physical interaction between Mr. O'Malley and Mr. Heenan, he made a radio transmission which included the statement, "There's a fight." That radio transmission is logged with a time in the 911 center. We also know that Officer Heimsness, after making that radio transmission, took 2 to 3 steps towards Mr. O'Malley and Mr. Heenan before he began to give those verbal orders. That's something that Officer Heimsness stated and was verified by Mr. O'Malley as well. This motion, these couple of steps, actually starts to shorten that 15-second time window. And of course, the back end of that are the 3 shots being fired, which is captured on the 911 call. I would like to do just a very quick demonstration of that 15-second time lapse to give you all an idea of how quickly this happened, because as I said before, as investigators, we've analyzed this, and sometimes we get away from how fast this happened. So I would like to do that. All I'm going to do is basically do a 15-second countdown on a stopwatch on my cell phone here. And it starts with that radio transmission. There's a fight, verbal orders given to comply, there's a physical interaction, and then the shots are fired. So here's the 15 seconds. There's a fight. Step, step, get down. You, get down, get down. The physical interaction is now occurring. Stop, get back, stop, get back, stop. And that's the 15 seconds. That is how quickly this situation occurred from the time Officer Heimsness sees the physical altercation till the shots are fired. And let me do that one more time. There's a fight. Step, step. You, get down. Get down. You, get down. There's a physical interaction going on at this point. Stop. Get back. Stop. Get back. Stop. And there's the 15 seconds. So the point being that we are analyzing something that's very, very fast. As the Chief mentioned earlier, any evaluation of police use of force must be judged from the perspective of a reasonable officer at the scene. Officer Heimsness' use of force decisions in this case have been determined to be objectively reasonable. One of the things that we would like to do today is play a video. On November 19th, 2012, the resident at the location of this call and witness, Kevin O'Malley, provided a physical demonstration of the physical interaction that had occurred both between Mr. O'Malley and Paul Heenan and between Paul Heenan and Officer Heimsness. This demonstration was video recorded. It's important to remember that this particular video only shows one witness's perspective of these events. And the statements made by Officer Heimsness, Officer Trombley, and other witnesses in the area were also taken into account in both of the investigations, the criminal and the internal. It is also important to remember that this video is about 15 minutes long, but it's an attempt to display something that happened very quickly, and again with a physical interaction between Mr. Heenan and Officer Heimsness occurring over less than 15 seconds.
We're still at the South Police District Station, and in general we have transitioned away from the interview room that we did our first interview with Kevin, and we moved into the South Police District briefing room for the purpose of demonstrating essentially two phases. The first would be the contact between Kevin and Paul, the physical contact, and we're going to in general try and recreate that using, in general, Kevin as though he is Paul and Detective Reister as though she is Kevin. Are you recording this as well?
Yes.
Okay. The second thing that we're going to try and capture would be after Kevin breaks off from Paul and has an encounter with Officer Heimsness. So we'll break it into two segments. And we'll label the first segment, segment one, which is again Kevin and Paul's interaction. For the purpose of this video, if I didn't say so already, it's 5:17 p.m. This wall, and please correct me if I'm wrong, we're going to use in general as Baldwin Street. This wall in the briefing room is going to in general be the houses, to include roughly 509, 511, 513 South Baldwin Street. As we continue to orient ourselves, directionally speaking, this way would be the intersection of Jennifer Street and South Baldwin, and that behind Detective Reister, who is again acting as though she is Officer Heimsness, would be the general direction of Baldwin and Spade Street. Are we spatially accurate?
That's correct.
Okay.
You ready? We're in the... In the frame.
Okay. You know I could have called the cops.
You want to get weird?
Okay.
Okay.
So by me looking over the shoulder is what Kevin said he did when he observed Officer Hines' for the first time.
I didn't grab your arms that time, but
You want to do it one more time?
sure.
Okay.
I could have called the cops.
You want to get weird?
Does that feel pretty accurate? I know. Again, you articulated earlier before we went live on the recording that it's hard to estimate force,
Right.
but
I think
as
that-
best you can from what you observed.
Yes.
Okay.
Somewhere between that first take and that second take, yes.
Okay. So then the second segment that we'll replay is after Kevin has broken off from Paul. So again, Kevin would be at the terrace with his back to the street of Baldwin Street, and then he would ultimately move around to his driveway. Do you think it's important for us to build an actor into that which would represent you, or can we just have it be you being Paul again and Detective Reister being Officer Hines?
It might be helpful for that, actually,
Okay.
for me. Yeah.
Okay. You want me to do it?
Are you comfortable with
Yes,
this?
absolutely. Okay. So I will then stand in this frame of view and be, again, Kevin, after Kevin has broken off from Paul, standing at the terrace, looking, generally speaking, towards the houses.
So you would have let go of me,
Okay.
and when the officer said, get down,
Okay. I spin back to the terrace.
Get down, get down.
you would have, the get down came before,
Okay.
well, one second. Get down came as he was walking up when you let go, or when I let go.
Put people in position. Yeah, position.
Do we want to refer to our map, what positions we used on our map?
I think we just showed the physical,
Okay.
the physical engagement. I think we went over pretty clearly, and I don't want to get hung up on exactly what point someone was at when they said get down. You know what I mean? What I really want to capture is the physical
Right.
nature.
So you let go of me as Paul, and you're coming towards me, and I shift my attention from you to the officer, and I go like this. That's where the physical contact took place.
Okay.
And I don't know that we moved as far as we moved before, just now.
Okay.
So Detective Reister should maybe not back up as much?
Right. So
Okay.
maybe about here.
Okay.
Please use
We'll do it
the
again.
amount of force that you think.
Okay. So you let go of me. Like that.
Okay.
And at that point, after seeing the beginning of that, and this is an important point, that's when I started to move. After seeing the beginning of this, that's when I started to move.
Okay.
I saw part of this as I moved around the officer and Paul Heenan. And then the next place I stopped was in our driveway and saw at that point more or less the same movements going on for probably a period of 4 to 5 seconds. And that's when I saw the officer then stand up,
Step back with.
take a step back, get into a shooting stance. And at the same time as that happened, Paul do a similar movement, step back. I saw Paul's eyes at this point from about where you are. It was about a 5 to 6 foot space between the officer and Paul, by my estimation. It was at that time when I noticed the second police officer was about here. And so, as I've described, it's a triangle between the 2 police officers and Paul. If you had me in the mix, that the four of us made a cross shape.
Sure.
When as the police officers stood up, as Paul did, that's when the separation seemed to occur. I saw Paul's eyes, as I said, and when immediately before the police officer shot, it seemed like Paul was moving down into a position like this. When he was shot, he seemed to fall this way, and as I said, it seemed like he fell in pain and fell almost into a fetal position with his face.
Feel free to demonstrate if you will.
I cracked my head on the desk, so he went like this,
So
was shot 3 times,
bang, bang, bang.
fell like this, and then I believe he sort of slowly rolled over onto his back. At that point, as I disengaged with Paul, I was yelling, "He's my neighbor. He's a neighbor," multiple times. But from when I disengaged and continued to, and saw him continue towards the police officer, to when I stopped in the driveway. After I saw the shots, I as I've stated, moved up the driveway, up onto our porch and into our house. Prior to, as I was moving up the driveway, I heard the police officer who shot Paul look at and say to the other police officer, "He went for my gun."
Okay.
Keep it recording.
Is there anything else that you would like, that you think that you haven't shared with us today, either in the interview room or in this room here, that you think is important? I know we've been here a long time.
You asked me that same question before we left the other room, and I gave you a couple points there which I know have been captured. I think that's it.
Did we capture in the other interview room the question about whether or not any more observation of an
No.
injury? Okay. One thing that we also wanted to sort of talk or discuss with you was that morning we identified a possible abrasion or mark on your arm. You had actually explained at one point, again, I think you identified 2 different marks that you observed that you think were like...
The investigator, Officer
Yep.
Barr, I believe,
Yep.
was the one who looked at my arm and said, "Was that there before? Was that there before?" And I said, "I don't know. I'm not sure." He took a DNA swab
Yep.
of my arm.
Yep.
But here's my arm.
So in general, you haven't had any new bruising or new injuries like that. You also, if you will, as we were waiting for the videotape to come here, one of the things that we talked about was describing how hard Paul grabbed you by your wrists. And if I want to go on record, but I want to be accurate, I thought you described it as being like a snake bite in the sense that the amount of force that was used.
That's what Jake said.
Okay.
The only way I can describe it is if someone were to grab your arm, if you had your arm clenched on something, they grabbed your arm, and you felt it for the next 10 to 15 minutes, not in pain, but just that general feeling of this arm has been grabbed. That's the force.
Okay.
I only felt it on my right arm. I didn't feel that on my left arm.
If you will, we also thought we would have you sign and date this drawing. It's November 16th. You can pick anywhere. Thank you. And I'm just generally speaking noting that he's signing it at about 5:28 p.m. You keep going. We'll stay alive here.
Yeah. It's up to you.
They were asking you if you had anything more to say. When we talked earlier, you were expressing your view about whether you were threatened or fearful.
Yeah, I think it's with the arm thing, and I think it's the fact that I was turning to call for help. I wouldn't turn to call for help if I felt like a punch was going to be thrown. I didn't feel like that's where this was going. I wasn't fearful of it. I didn't feel in complete danger. I felt like...
What would it take you to feel in danger then?
Someone throwing a punch at me, someone trying to tackle me, somebody kicking me, somebody elbowing me in the face and then running towards my house, moving a lot quicker than how we were moving, not willfully being part of the movement in the form of a backpedal. A lot of factors would have made me feel more in fear of
One thing you articulated to me that morning was that you were thinking, how am I going to get out of this?
Yeah.
Is that accurate?
That is accurate. And I remember looking down at his leg and thinking, can I sweep his leg and throw him down? And I decided I couldn't. But yeah, it was one of those thoughts, how am I going to get out of this?
And is it also fair to say that you were thinking that you did need some help?
Yes, that's
Okay.
That's why I turned my head. What I was picturing help to be was more diffusing the situation, helping to reverse the situation, acknowledging that this was a neighbor who was in need of help back into his home, and hoping, either my wife or another neighbor could assist with that.
Okay. So, I understand.
Anything else?
Okay. This will conclude our interview then, and it's 5:31 p.m. on the 16th of November. Thank you.
Sure, we are going to open it up for Q&A, but there have been a number of questions that have been asked prior to this. We've either received emails or requests from citizens. A couple of the questions I will put out there, and we'll let our experts from our training section attempt to address these questions that have been put out by the public. And there's primarily four that have been a reoccurring theme. One is, why 3 shots? Secondarily is, why not a taser? A third is the issue of distance and how that relates to force. And then the last one has to do with, when we are using force, deadly force with a firearm, kind of what is our objective? It usually manifests itself as, why didn't the officer aim for the leg? It's kind of the question that continues to come up. So those are the 4 questions. Why 3 shots? Why not a taser? Talking about the distance, and there is some variation in reports of the distance, and then the issue of the shots and the purpose of the shot. So what I'm going to do is slide away so that our training experts can respond to those questions, and after we've exhausted the response to those, again, we will open it up for Q&A.
And Chief, could you ask that first question?
Sure. First question is, why 3 shots in this incident?
If we could actually take a moment and take a step back, because we want to try to get kind of some broad issues out of the way, which hopefully will at least touch on some of the questions that the Chief mentioned, and then we'll deal with some of the more specifics if we fail to get there. So what we're talking about here essentially is decision making. And we understand that there are a lot of factors that go into decision making. But the first thing that we want to get across as trainers and as police officers is that there are different environments in which we make decisions. Police officers spend most of our lives in. We refer to that as a strategic or long-term decision-making environment. And what that means is that if I'm going to decide what TV I'm going to buy, the clothes I'm going to wear, the food I'm going to pack in my lunch, I have lots of options to choose from. I have a lot of information that I can use to evaluate those options. And most importantly, I have almost unlimited time in which to make those decisions. In police use of force situations, we call that the tactical decision-making environment. Here, I have very few options, and we'll get into the reason why that is. I have very little information, and ultimately what's driving my inability to get more choices, more options, my inability to get more information is I have very little time. And as Lieutenant Olivas clearly articulated, we're talking about 15 seconds for the entire incident. Now sometimes, and I've talked to people before about this, and sometimes we can get lost in the jargon or the environment of policing. So I wanted to throw out an example that I hope can mesh with a lot of people, or at least make this somewhat more real for you. And then Kimba, Officer 2, will get into some of the police underpinnings of it. But most of us in this room have driven a car. We've driven in heavy traffic. We've driven in heavy traffic at speed. What I'd like you to think about for just a moment is you're driving along the Beltline. It's a beautiful sunny day. Traffic is moving at speed, but it's heavy traffic. You're driving along, doing everything you think you should be doing, and then without any warning, the car in front of you slams on its brakes. We only have a couple of choices in this. We have now gone from a strategic environment, what am I going to have to dinner tonight when I get home, to a tactical environment. Very little time, very quickly. I only have limited options in that situation. I can swerve, I can slam on my brakes, or I can do a combination of both. As much as I would like to, I can't do other things. Tactical decision-making environment. What information do I need to have to decide which is the better choice? As I go through this myself, I think I'd want to know exactly what the road conditions are, what the wear on my tires are, what's the roll tolerance for the vehicle I'm in. Is there a semi moving up on my right that if I swerve right, it's going to be worse than if I don't? What is the stop distance for my make and model of vehicle? Even if I have all of that information, which is very unlikely, I don't have the time to go through and process A, B, C, D, E down the line, and thus I am basically given a very limited number of choices, brake, swerve combination, and I have very, very little time to make that decision. So that's just a sort of a non-police way of looking at the tactical decision-making environment that we were looking at on that morning.
And then as it relates to police training, again, one of the other questions, we're going a little bit somewhat out of order here, but why not a taser was one of the questions that was asked, and I think asked repeatedly regarding this incident. And again, it goes to reactionary time and reactionary gap. In high-risk situations such as burglaries, home invasions, even stolen vehicles, where the threats are unknown to the officer. So again, as Sergeant Friedman pointed out, when we have limited information or unknown information, to start at a lower level of force where we cannot respond effectively puts the officer at a disadvantage. And the disadvantage to the officer, again, not only could hurt the officer, but could also hurt the public, other people in the area, etc., the victims, the original callers. So police training, again, across the state of Wisconsin, not just in the city of Madison, but across the state of Wisconsin, really nationwide, in those high-risk situations, we're going to start at a higher level of force, generally speaking, something that will be more effective until we can ascertain proof positive that the subject is unarmed, that it is a lower risk situation than we initially were dispatched. So again, recalling or recounting the facts of this particular situation, we have a burglary in progress and then a fight, essentially. When the officer arrives on scene, he sees there's a physical altercation or a struggle. And so again, to start on those two bits of information at a lower level, such as a taser, if now at the point of contact, when he gives the orders, get down on the ground, the subject presents a weapon as opposed to an unarmed response, it's too late or too long for the officer to have to transition from that taser to a firearm to deal with a deadly force threat to his or her life.
And again, that's a reactionary gap. That simply means that action is always faster than reaction, and the less distance you have, the less time you have to try to overcome that disadvantage. If you wait until the person decides to do A, your B must follow A. It can't beat it. It probably can't even tie it, and that puts our officers at a big disadvantage. And that's something that we wanted to do some demonstrations, if we could, today to try to demonstrate that in sort of an order and give you guys a sense of how quickly these things can happen.
And I think, again, through the demonstration, that reaction gap will be made more clear, and also, I think, address some of the other questions about number of rounds, distancings, and that kind of thing. So,
for safety purposes, we're going to deal with some equipment for just a moment. We're probably going to go in front of the tables.
I don't know if that.
We can both speak fairly loud, I think, but this is more of a visual issue anyway. So Officer 2 will be a subject, and I will be the officer. And he already mentioned this idea of what choice do we make going into unknowns. We don't know what the subject's intentions, their motivation, their training, the equipment that they carry, if they're armed, if they're fleeing from something heinous that they just did, or if it's some other thing. So we don't know those going into a situation. So that's what drives our initial decision, that first decision point. Is this a firearm day? Is this something else? And as the Chief mentioned, as Officer 2 mentioned, felonious situations, burglaries in progress, a variety of other calls, it's going to be a firearm, and hopefully what we'll demonstrate here is why that is. So I come across the subject. I can see, what I can see is that I don't see any weapons in his hands. I don't see any weapons on him. Now we know that doesn't mean he doesn't have weapons. For whatever reason, I've decided to utilize my taser. Now, the taser is a great tool, but our experience as an organization is it works 60 to 65% of the time, give or take clothing and a host of other conditions. So I've made a decision that I am going to get him at taser point, essentially. Now, I'm giving him commands. The commands are going to be get down on the ground, police, get down on the ground. He decides whether he chooses to obey those commands or not. No matter how well I project, how well I'm presenting myself, he ultimately makes the decision to escalate, to attack, to aggress on me, or to comply. And the vast majority of people, when confronted at either taser point or at firearm point, do comply. And that's the vast majority. So at some point, he's going to choose to do what he's going to choose to do. He's going to act. And now I have to react to his action. Reactionary gap. Yep, go ahead. Yeah. Police, get on the ground. Okay? It takes an untrained person, and this has been done in research and studies that we can make available as needed. An untrained person who's never shot a firearm before can draw and deliver accurate fire at these distances in under a half a second. 4/10, 3/10 of a second. A really well-trained police officer who practices a lot can draw and deliver one round in somewhat over a second. So we're already talking about he's already faster than I am potentially, and I still have to react to what I'm seeing. It's no longer this, it's now this. And that reactionary gap adds to the amount of difference between the time when he points his weapon at me and I can get my weapon out at him. And multiple rounds can be shot in tenths of a second. It's very easy to shoot 4, 5, 6, 7 rounds in a second under high levels of stress.
So that, I think, addresses the taser question now, to the extent we did. The other question is, if he has the weapon out, in the facts of this case, where he has the weapon out, and we talk about distances, how is that dangerous? And what distance is ostensibly an unarmed person dangerous to an armed officer here? So if we talk about this situation, I think a little bit more of what we saw in the facts of the case, again, not in dispute. He's pointing the gun and he's giving orders. The officer is giving orders. Okay. Now, again, depending on distance, even if we talk about 5 to 6 feet, someone that's highly motivated to hurt this officer, to take the weapon, can cover this distance in 2 steps, 1 step. And I'm relatively short-statured, so even one of my steps, a short stride, closes that distance. And I'm right on top of the gun, and now maybe taking that weapon.
And the gun won't function if it's grabbed in that manner. It won't cycle correctly.
So, again, we also have to consider, if we're thinking about the facts of the case, one hand up. So now we don't have a two-handed grip on this So now a weaker grip to that gun, maybe I have this hand, we're in close proximity. Again, facts not in dispute as far as I understand it from multiple witnesses here. From these distances, I'm even closer to the weapon, and he has a weaker grip, if you will, being that it's only one hand, a single hand grip versus two. Again, we think about what it takes to disarm, nothing at all. For me to rip that gun and I'll apply deadly force to the officer. So when we're thinking, again, thin slicing and talking about distances and time and reactionary time, we lack that time, we lack other options when we're at these distances.
So we're going to go back to this where we're going to try to recreate this incident where there's somewhat approximately 4 to 6 feet, 3 to 5 feet. It's a very short distance. Officer has chosen to get his weapon out based on the circumstances. Felony in progress, children in the house, mom calling it in, sees a physical altercation. These are all very unusual factors. Now we add to that the unusual factors of the suspect aggressing on a fully uniformed officer, pointing his gun at him, which is very, very unusual. And now we have a decision point for the officer in question. We're very close. One choice that I have is to continue to wait. I'm going to give him one more verbal command to see if he complies. Police, get on the ground! Police, get on the ground! If I keep waiting, by the time I react to his action, that aggressive lunge, it's too late. Reactionary gap. It takes me 2, 3, 4 tenths of a second to process that he's not surrendering, he's lunging forward. By the time my brain physically is able to process that, he's got my weapon, and now he has my weapon, I am unarmed, and threat to the community and to myself. Another option is I can try to holster my weapon up so he can't get it. So, police, I start to holster, and in fact we can go this way. Again, a very practiced police officer under stress may get it in their holster, they may not, but it doesn't matter. As I'm holstering up, he's lunging forward, and now I'm on my back. I'm unable to get this weapon into play, and I'm much more vulnerable. The third option is to keep backpedaling. There are a couple of issues with this. First, it is not possible for me to move faster backwards than it is for him to move forwards, unless one of us has some physical issue. So I'm backing up, and we're now back to this. If I wait, he's going to have that opportunity, and I don't know what his intentions are. I just know that he's ignored my verbal commands. He's come towards me as a fully uniformed officer despite my gun being pointed at him. All these other factors which we've talked about. Another option is I can try to turn and create distance. I think I'm faster than he is if I turn around. So I turn. Okay, that's a bad outcome for us. We don't train that for obvious reasons. I cannot turn my back on that threat.
And maybe the fourth to the transition, but it's very similar to the holstering to transition. Do you want to even do that?
Yeah, we train transitioning from the taser to the firearm a couple of different ways. The fastest is going to be this. Okay? That's going to be the fastest. There are other ways we do it, but at some point I recognize it's no longer a taser day. 3 or 4 tenths of a second. I drop the taser, start going for my weapon, add another 1 to 1 1/4 seconds if I'm really fast. That's 1.5 seconds to 2 seconds. He can cross this entire length of the room this way in 2 seconds if he really wants to. That's just the speed that he is able to attain.
But again, limited information. We don't know how fast Paul Heenan can move.
Or what his motivation is,
or why he's moving toward us after we've pointed a weapon at him and ordered him down. So those are the things that are in play, some of the things that have to be considered when we think about how does the officer come to the decision he or she makes.
The other question that the chief raised was why 3 shots? And there's a very black and white policy or law answer, which is you shoot until the threat is stopped. But there's also that reactionary gap issue, that physiological issue, which is I perceive that he is a threat. He's trying to disarm me. That's a deadly threat to me. So I utilize deadly force. By the time he no longer is a threat, his actions have changed. I have to react to the unfolding circumstances. So I'm shooting. As the threat is ceasing, I get my finger off the trigger, but there's going to be a gap between the time when I recognize he's no longer a threat to the time I get my finger off of the trigger. That gap might be, again, 1/10 of a second, but rounds can be delivered in a 1/10 of a second under stress. And clearly we had a very high stress fluid and dynamic situation unfolding here.
And I think the final question as far as the shot placement, why not shoot in the leg, why not shoot to wound, why not fire a warning shot? Again, when we're facing a deadly force threat, in this case, that is the officer's perception, he's going to be disarmed, right? And if disarmed, so disarmed, that gun will be used against him, because what other reasonable conclusion could the officer draw? Why would anyone go for the weapon if not to use it, and use it specifically against the officer or someone else? It's highly unlikely the subject was intending to take the weapon and remove the magazine, render it safe, those type of things. So that being the conclusion, a deadly force threat presents, or the officer's perception of that deadly force, the way we train firearms instruction is that we will shoot to stop the threat. And the shot placement, again, for us, high center mass, because they are most likely to stop that threat. They're going to be the most effective, rather than when we talk about the movement aspect, this in a dynamic situation, even if I have A1 rating as marksman, if the target is moving, in this case the hand, or the foot, or the leg, and you're trying to shoot to that area, highly unlikely your rounds will make contact or impact that area, as opposed to a larger mass, such as upper body, or the central nervous system specifically, which we know that's what will stop action. Immediate cessation is when we interrupt that central nervous system, so our rounds are going to be placed in that area. So hence the reason why we don't shoot wound in the leg, foot, hand, that type of thing. It's contrary to our training, and that is also very much in alignment with not just City of Madison police training, but state of Wisconsin, and also nationwide. You could research that further and find it's very much in compliance with those other agencies' practices.
What about the initial approach? As Officer Heisman closed the gap between Heenan and O'Malley, is that standard, or should he stay back a little further so that he can't rush him?
The question here, I'm sorry, I don't want to.
No, please.
Both Lieutenant Olivas and I think the Chief mentioned, when we look at officers' use of force and use of force decision making, it does have a standard of objective reasonableness. And so we don't use necessarily hindsight 20/20 vision. And Graham versus Connor is a Supreme Court case that talks about that specifically, that's unfair to the officer to use that. Because, quite frankly, anybody in hindsight, using 20/20 vision, could say there was something else they could have done. You could have waited, Officer Himes.
Well, I'm asking from your training standpoint.
Sure.
Do you train the officer to approach that or to hang back?
I'm gonna I guess answer the question with it depends as an answer, but more specifically I'll define it as we can't train, and this is just a reality of training, we can't train for every eventuality, because there's an infinite number of responses that the subject, citizens, right, could present to the officer, a myriad of situations that we can't provide for every single one, every single time. So there has to be that degree of reasonableness and, in some ways, discretion that we leave to the officers. Now, again, going back to the second guessing part, I just want to address that. Was it reasonable? That's really the question here. I understand yours, but I just want to reiterate that the real question for us as trainers, for the internal investigators, chief, the agency, and even the public should be, is that reasonable? That action reasonable? If I step forward, again, I have two people are fighting, maybe my initial intention is to stop harm from the person calling. If I wait, like Sergeant Friedman said, I could wait. You're right. I could wait. I could hide behind a tree, maybe stay at gunpoint and wait and see what happens. Maybe the subject doesn't knock the homeowner unconscious. Maybe he doesn't go in and get into the house and barricade himself and now take the wife and women, children hostage. I could wait. That is an option, certainly. Or maybe I do step forward, announce my presence physically, give verbal commands, and maybe that's the better outcome. And so in terms of our tactics, we teach, again, they have that discretion, they have that ability to decide for themselves, given what information they do have at the time.
There's a range of reasonable options that we believe that fell within that range for reasons that Officer Himes has articulated in his report, as well as for what we know as trainers and officers.
Do you know how many officers have been killed in line of duty with their own firearm?
I don't. I mean, we could find that out, but that's a percentage of officers killed are
a significant
disarmed.
percentage, I would say.
Yeah.
And there's been recent incidents where
the
officers
FBI Leoka law enforcement officers killed website might. I mean that's where I would go if I were to go right after this and look it up. I would go there and they break it down into different categories.
Two questions for Chief Wray.
Chief, I'd like to know what your investigation determined with regard to the representation made by Kevin O'Malley that he repeatedly said he's a neighbor, he's a neighbor. After talking to the officers who were there at the scene, were you able to confirm that he was indeed yelling that as this took place? And secondly, can you confirm or give information as to whether the Officer Himes, has ever at any point identified himself as a police officer?
Sure. Good question. First of all, and Dan, who is really more intimately involved with the investigation, it is my understanding from all accounts there that Kevin O'Malley did indicate that he is a neighbor. As you saw in the video, Kevin O'Malley is a credible witness. I have no reason to doubt what he said. But the officer, Officer Himes, did not hear that, at least as the investigation revealed, that he did not hear that. Other neighbors, I believe, as the investigation revealed, heard him say either he's my neighbor or heard him say something.
Chief, let me jump in here. What, in particular, from the reports from the criminal investigation, Mr. O'Malley has been very consistent that he was making those statements, as you saw in the video, as he moved. Officer Himes reported not hearing anything from Mr. O'Malley until after the shots were fired. Officer Tromley, as she was approaching, was able to hear very clearly Officer Himes give the orders to Mr. Heenan, but she heard nothing from Mr. O'Malley at that point. There's also, I think, at least one other neighbor who heard Officer Himes giving commands, did not hear anything about a neighbor. Now, and again, we found Mr. O'Malley to be very forthcoming in all this. There's, in my mind, two possibilities for this. The most simple explanation is that Officer Himes was drowning him out. That we know that Officer Himes started shouting commands virtually, almost right away after taking those couple of steps towards the two of them. He's shouting commands at Mr. Heenan to get down, and then after they engage physically, he's shouting at him to stop and get back. And those were heard, as I said, by other witnesses. It's entirely possible that Officer Himes was drowning him out. The other option, and this is again kind of is detailed as part of the internal investigation, is that Officer Himes may, once he's involved in this physical altercation, have been suffering from something that we call auditory exclusion, which is very common in officer-involved shootings and officers involved in deadly force situations, where the shots quite often sound very muted, or they don't hear them. They see the gun, they see the flash of the weapon, but they don't hear anything. When people are involved in high-stress situations where they fear for their lives, I guess the overriding point is oftentimes they don't hear everything. And I can't say which or both of those is true in this case, but we do know that Officer Himes reports not hearing that.
To your reports, which we were given a big stack, and I've looked through and I've tried to find some mention to the neighbor remark. Maybe I'm missing it. Do you make any mention at all that was communicated according to Kevin O'Malley in all of this material?
I think so.
I thought that was in there.
I believe so.
Can you answer the question about whether Officer Himes has ever at any point identified himself as a police officer?
If we could for a second just jump in.
Sir, if you could step
Oh, I'm sorry, and I'm sorry, but we had talked about this earlier. So we have a 15-second incident. We have limited time, information, and options. Let's say that information comes out that this is a neighbor. There is still the action of the officer presenting a deadly force threat in full uniform saying, "Get down." He knows he's a neighbor now, and the neighbor still aggresses on him. And so there are other actions and other information that, even had that been heard by Officer Himes, auditory exclusion or other reasons why he didn't, ultimately other things are happening that are going to, I know that now, but what else do I know? I also know that you're refusing my verbal commands, you're engaged in a physical altercation with me, you're attempting to wrest my weapon away from me. Whether I know you're a neighbor at that point is moot from a standpoint of whether the deadly force decision was justified.
Yeah, and appreciate the totality of the circumstances, but to answer the questions directly on this one, the officer did not identify himself as a police officer. What the officer did was start to give commands, and that reinforces the quick, fluid, ever-evolving, dynamic situation that we had going on here, to give commands for Paul Heenan to get down.
And just more to the identification, if I may. Given time of day, given the incident and situation, when the officer gives those commands, it's highly unusual, and in some ways you could argue not reasonable for a citizen, a subject, to believe it was anyone other than police. Who besides an officer would say in the middle of the night, as you're in the struggle in front of a house, "Get down, get down, get down"? Also, let's not forget that Officer Heimses was dressed in a full military uniform. So while it would be, again, ideal to give a verbal identification in addition to my physical presence, my uniform presence, it's not always necessary. It's not required, not by policy, certainly not by training, to identify yourself before you take police action. I'm a police officer when I'm ready to be identified as a police officer for my attire.
The investigation did reveal, for the other person that was at the scene, was Kevin O'Malley, did recognize Officer Heimses as a police officer, and then at some point in time begin to react to what was going on in terms of his commands.
Chief, in the videotape recreation, O'Malley notes that there is an initial command from Heimses, then he goes through his steps to include how he had circled around and had said, "He's a neighbor, he's a neighbor." He makes no mention of some additional commands, "Stop, get back, stop, get back." Was that said by Heimses, and how did Heenan react? And I guess the second part of the question is, O'Malley seemed to describe Heenan going into a crouch. Did Heenan advance again? Can you take us through that?
To answer your second question, again, I think it's important to recognize how fast this happens, and the description of the shooting is, especially given by Officer Heimses, is much more fluid. It's, I think Mr. O'Malley is trying to really break this down into what he saw. Officer Heimses is really describing being in that position, being able to give one good shove to create some distance, and then stepping forward and firing virtually immediately. This is fast. This is really fast. The point being, I think the point that the training staff was making about this distance, if there's 5 or 6 feet in between Officer Heimses and Mr. Heenan's feet, Mr. Heenan is still within a step of being able to reach out and grab that firearm again.
So he didn't say, "Stop, get back." It was all a progression here. He got space to get safety and fired.
Right.
He didn't say, "Stop, get
back." No,
the
stop and get back was not happening when that separation happened. No, those comments. To answer the first question, in a different interview that's not that we didn't show here, I believe Mr. O'Malley acknowledges hearing Officer Heimses giving those commands, that kind of stop, get back. And as I said before, that was also heard by Officer Tromley as she came up.
So essentially, Heenan complied with the command to get back, to stop and get back.
No, he never did.
Occurred.
He never did. He was shoved back.
And you know that because of the officer's account?
Yes.
Or do you know that because of O'Malley's account? He said he didn't see that.
That's correct. He didn't. He was not clear on how the separation occurred, Mr. O'Malley.
Chief, what is the status of Officer Heimses going forward? Will he return to full active duty? Will he return to duty in some other way, or is there even consideration that he would end his career at the Madison Police Department voluntarily with a retirement?
Sure. During the course of this investigation, as in always, The officer was placed on administrative leave as a result of his exoneration of both policy violations. That administrative leave will be lifted. He will be assigned back to patrol. Where and when is yet to be determined.
Other questions?
Yeah, Chief, did the officers arrive on the scene in a car? Did the car have the lights going? And is there dashboard video available of the scene as it unfolded near the vehicle?
I don't know about the lights. I know there's not dashboard video.
There were no lights.
No lights. No lights, and there is no dashboard video of the incident.
Is there dashboard video that exists and it just doesn't indicate what's happening on the scene? It's pointed in a different direction, or?
Well, that I'm not sure
I'd
of.
like to maybe have the training staff, is this something you guys can tackle?
No. Was there?
There's it's my understanding that there's no video from Officer Himes' squad and no video from Officer Trombley's squad. They went in without their emergency lights going, so their video did not activate. There is some video that exists from officers after the shooting occurs responding to the scene. It's my understanding that doesn't show anything substantive other than them driving
So just to
there.
confirm, dashboard video all squads are equipped with dashboard video. It doesn't activate unless the lights on the squad car are activated, is that right?
I believe it can be manually activated as well.
I think this part of the training staff might be helpful to talk about responding to a burglary in progress or home invasion.
So the decision to come in without the lights and sirens on is a tactical decision that officers make when responding to a scene. They may choose to do that because they don't want to alert the suspect or other suspects that they're arriving. That gives them an advantage in case the suspect tries to flee or does try to arm themselves or engage the officer. So it's a common practice when responding to burglaries, even robberies, other crimes, that at some point short of arrival, the officer will disengage that equipment for their own safety and for an advantage to be able to approach the situation from a position of stealth, to be able to get more information, as Officer Himes has attempted to do in this, to be more covert rather than announce the presence minutes away.
What you presented today is an internal investigation, right? There's been only one investigation of this. There hasn't been an investigation by an agency other than the Madison Police Department.
Yep. Well,
and the reason I'm asking is it's not. I understand that there are some counties in the state when there's a police-involved shooting where they choose to have a different department actually, or the Department of Justice do it. And I'm curious about the rationale for, and it's not required by law, why Madison Police Department feels they should be doing the investigation.
Sure. Now, we've had a number of officer-involved investigations where we have done the investigation. We have had some of those where we have explored having the Sheriff's Department come in and do those. I believe that we can perform a fair and impartial officer-involved investigation. However, having said that, I do recognize the public's interest in a check and balance. And so we have explored with other executive Dane County law enforcement how exactly we would do that. Now, some of the other smaller jurisdictions will usually call in the state, DCI, to come in and do that. We're the second largest municipal law enforcement agency in the state of Wisconsin, and we do have the resources and the history of being able to do this. I am not opposed to exploring different options as to how to do this. One of the limitations, however, is these need to be, in some instances, investigated at a rapid manner. I've known a couple of these where witness statements, the fact that we have technology on the website, you can get information out in a moment's notice. And so to mobilize other agencies to come in and do these investigations sometimes sets the investigation back. But we are still in the process of looking at other agencies and how we can do that check and balance.
What about the lieutenant from the sheriff's office who had received using a report?
The purpose of the lieutenant shadowing the investigation was to have an extra pair of eyes on the investigation. We did not request that they would produce a report. That's not to say that there may be a summary of this is what I observed when I was there. That is still one of the issues that we are trying to resolve from a Dane County law enforcement executive standpoint, how to standardize that process. And take it to Dane County chiefs and say, when we have these, what should we expect from outside agencies? We have been doing that for the last 2 to 3 years on an informal basis. Dane County Sheriff Dave Mahoney has reached out to the Madison Police Department and some of his officer-involved shootings and has requested that I would provide personnel to monitor the investigation so that if the question comes up, that someone could respond to that. The lieutenant of the Sheriff's Department is here. But the purpose was primarily to monitor it. And in the event the question came up, he would be able to say what he saw, heard. But we did not request a formal report.
Ever since the investigation, the Madison Police Department, as well as Officer Keenan, has come under extreme scrutiny from the public. Don't you feel that putting Officer Keenan back on patrol would definitely... I'm sorry, Officer Hyman. Don't you feel putting him back on patrol would definitely not be productive for the Madison Police Department?
Sure. First of all, and I've been saying this since the beginning. It's a tragic set of circumstances that lead us to an officer-involved shooting. However, having said this is the business of policing, unfortunately, as it may be, that from time to time, a deadly force situation may arise where a police officer may have to take the life of someone else to save someone else or to save himself. The intent is to get Officer Steve Heimsness back in patrol, back in his assignment. We've got some things to do, not only from the standpoint of, externally, in terms of supporting the neighborhood from a healing standpoint, having access and supporting the family, but there are a number of internal things that come along with an officer-involved shooting that takes a lot of work to set the department back on a path. But job one is building trust. Job one, not only internally, but externally. And if there are things, I know in this community that there are some people that, given the nature of this incident, that's never going to believe that the right thing happened. And that happens with officer-involved shootings. And I do understand that. But we're still going to do everything we can to listen to the community, to improve what we do, and do everything we can do to build trust.
Chief, as much as it has been stated that Officer Heimsness was within his rights to deploy deadly force, and as much as there was a demonstration of the limitations of a taser, was Officer Heimsness even equipped with a taser when he responded?
Yeah. Yes. Yes, he was.
Chief Wray, was Officer Heimsness' history before this incident addressed in this investigation at all? And if so, how was it addressed and how did it play with you?
Sure. With every internal investigation that is sustained, where you have a policy violation that is sustained, the officers' body of work, their history of disciplinary investigation, their long history, as well as a comparable history of other officers with similar policy violations is reviewed. But it's not just their disciplinary history. And in this particular case, since the policy violations were not sustained, his priors do not come into play as part of the discussion. So it was not sustained, he was exonerated, so there is no need to go back and say what has happened in the past, what's been the history, what's the department's comparable disciplinary history within the department.
Chief, you mentioned that you'd like, I don't know if I'm using the right words, but either quick investigation or rapid investigation. Since tomorrow is 2 months, do you consider this a reasonable amount of time, or should it have happened quicker or faster, as you say?
Well, I would have loved for it to happen faster. Make no mistake about it. Our more recent officer-involved shootings have happened in a matter of days. And I think to some extent that has created an expectation, both internally and externally, that this investigation has taken longer than it should have. I believe that the district attorney, in reviewing this, wanted to ensure that he had all of the answers and had reviewed this in a very fair and thorough approach to this. Because there are a number of questions. To wake up in the morning on November 9th and get a call in the morning that we have an officer that's involved in an officer-involved shooting where you have in no weapon, you know that there are going to be a number of questions. And so I would like for things to move expeditiously, but as others have talked about in the community, this does deserve full public scrutiny, and I think it was probably to everyone's benefit to make sure that we had the information. Finally, to end with that, I do want to reiterate something. We did provide the internal affairs summary, and we provided that so that people could judge for their own, but they could have some of the questions that has been out there, as well as the video. So I think we have been about as transparent on this as we possibly can. I know that there are people that have different perspectives, different opinions on what took place here, but I believe as an organization we've been about as transparent as we can with this one.
Chief, have you been in contact with Officer Hines personally? And can you give us an idea of how he's been dealing with this situation in the days and weeks since the shooting?
Sure. I have been in contact with Officer Hines and other officers that was involved. This is a tough one. This is very difficult. An officer is pulled from their regular duty assignment. You take this job, you swear an oath to serve and protect and to save lives. It's counterintuitive to have people raise questions about your intent. It's very stressful, and that's with every officer-involved shooting. It is a great degree of stress, not only for him but also for his family. But at this juncture, we're going to transition him back to patrol. We're going to make sure that he has all that is needed to succeed, because it's in the best interest not only of him but the city of Madison.
We take one more question and then we can formally shut down, but people can stick around to answer more questions if you have.
For that transition, is there any sort of mandated therapy or training or anything that the officer has to go through before he gets back to active duty?
Sure. What we generally do, because an officer-involved shooting affects every officer in a different way. As you may recall, some of the officer-involved shootings that we've had here in the city of Madison, we've got some officers that's difficult for them to come back to work. We get some officers that come back immediately. It affects every officer in a different way. We'd like to assess where the officer is before we mandate something. We do make EAP available. We do make peer support. We do provide briefings for the officers so that they can work through this. There's a clear history with police officers and officer-involved shootings with a connection with post-traumatic stress. So we're very sensitive and conscious to making sure that transition takes place. But directly answering your questions, we do not mandate. We try to go where the officer is.
Thanks everybody for coming. We certainly can stick around and answer